You think you know ancient Persia, the majestic empire, the glittering palaces of Persepolis, the legendary king of kings, whose word was law over a vast realm. But what if I told you that behind those walls of unimaginable opulence, within the carefully guarded chambers of the royal harem, the most powerful men on earth indulged in rituals so depraved, so utterly devoid of human dignity, that history itself conspired to forget them? Today, we are pulling back the veil on the Achaemenid Empire's darkest secrets, where absolute power didn't just corrupt absolutely, it created a system of human degradation designed to satisfy the most twisted appetites imaginable. The heart of ancient Persian power wasn't just in the throne room, but in the Anderun, the royal harem. Far more than a collection of wives and concubines, this was a meticulously managed system, a human inventory, curated and controlled with bureaucratic precision that would make modern corporations envious. It wasn't simply a matter of preference, but of strategic statecraft. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of individuals were housed within its sprawling complex, each person an entry in a vast administrative ledger, their lives dictated by royal whim. For the King of Kings, the women and, unsettlingly, the young boys within its walls were not just companions, but commodities, symbols of his absolute dominion, living trophies of his boundless power, each a testament to his right to claim any human life for his pleasure. The acquisition system for the Anderun was as systematic as any military campaign, a permanent, self-sustaining mechanism of human procurement. Provincial governors, throughout the sprawling Achaemenid Empire, understood their duties extended far beyond tax collection and military levies. Their careers, indeed their very lives, depended on their ability to constantly supply the royal court with a quota of gifts. The most beautiful women, and disturbingly, the most comely boys, often taken from newly conquered territories, families indebted beyond measure, or communities simply deemed expendable. These weren't voluntary offerings, presented with pomp and circumstance. They were brutal levies, enforced with the full might of imperial authority. Refusal to meet the king's demands meant swift and brutal retribution, not just for the offending official, but for entire communities. Their fields burned, their villages razed, their populations decimated as a chilling example. Imagine being a local official receiving detailed royal edicts, not about infrastructure projects or diplomatic treaties, but about specific physical attributes, precise age ranges, and desired temperaments for the king's personal service. A euphemism for a fate that stripped away all dignity and hope. These recruitment expeditions scoured the empire with cold, methodical efficiency, turning poverty and military conquest into a direct pipeline for sexual slavery. Agents, often high-ranking eunuchs, whose own emasculation often made them ruthlessly effective, carried detailed manifests, cataloging individuals with the same dispassionate precision one might apply to agricultural produce or war spoils. A girl from Babylon, noted for her graceful dancing and suitable for entertainment. A boy from Lydia, praised for his quiet demeanor and obedient potential. These weren't just names or descriptions. They were entries in a vast, impersonal ledger, each one a human being destined for a life within walls that, from the outside, promised unimaginable luxury and privilege, but from within, delivered utter, inescapable degradation. The journey to the imperial capitals of Persepolis or Susa was meticulously engineered to be the first step in their psychological dismantling. Transported in heavy, covered wagons, their eyes forbidden from glimpsing the route, They were systematically disoriented, losing all sense of direction or origin. They were forbidden from speaking their native tongues, their only communication allowed in the royal dialect of the court, a language entirely foreign to them. This enforced silence, coupled with the inability to speak of their past lives or families, began the process of severing them from everything they had ever known. Upon arrival, they were assigned new names, often generic or symbolic, deliberately stripping them of the identities their parents had given them. The new language they were forced to learn was not just a means of communication, but an ideological tool, reinforcing their new, terrifying status as mere property, possessions without agency or will. The message, delivered through every subtle gesture and harsh command, was unmistakably clear. Your old life is dead. Your family, your village, your very name, all gone. You belong to the king now, body and soul. Upon arrival at the vast and intimidating gates of the royal harem, these new specimens underwent rigorous processing, a chilling euphemism for a series of dehumanizing examinations. This included not just medical inspections that violated every concept of human decency imaginable, invasive, public, and designed to assess physical suitability with brutal frankness, but also comprehensive psychological assessments. Officials, who were almost invariably high-ranking eunuchs, conducted these evaluations with the detached professionalism of scientists observing laboratory subjects. They would meticulously evaluate each individual's potential for obedience, their capacity for resistance, and their suitability for various special assignments, a sinister term that masked unspeakable acts. Surviving fragments of administrative tablets, written in the cold, precise language of bureaucracy, describe conditioning protocols implemented for those showing excessive emotional attachment to previous circumstances. Imagine that, a child weeping for their parents, and this system labeling it an excessive emotional attachment. He's not describing human beings torn from their families. He's writing about them like they're manufacturing defects in a production line, flaws to be systematically erased, their spirits broken until they were pliable, voiceless instruments of the king's will. At the heart of the Underun's horrifying efficiency stood the eunuchs, a powerful and feared caste who served as the king's eyes, ears, and enforcers within this gilded cage. Castrated at a young age, often themselves victims of the very system they came to manage, they were uniquely positioned. For boys destined for this life, the act of emasculation was not merely a physical alteration, but a profound psychological severance, a brutal initiation that stripped them of their masculine identity and, crucially, any claim to dynastic ambition. They held no claim to the throne, could sire no heirs, and thus their loyalty was considered absolute, their ambition channeled solely into serving the King of Kings. But this absolute loyalty often manifested as absolute cruelty, a chilling echo of the trauma they themselves endured. Their own brokenness, meticulously crafted by the same imperial machine, became their qualification, making them ideal instruments for inflicting the king's will upon others, who were now deemed human property. These weren't merely domestic staff. The chief eunuchs held immense power, rivaling that of provincial governors or military generals. Their influence extended far beyond the harem walls, often acting as the king's most trusted advisors and spies, privy to state secrets and controlling access to the monarch himself. They managed vast budgets, drawn directly from the royal treasury, overseeing every aspect of the Andarun's operations, from security to training to the procurement of exotic pleasures for the king. This included not just the maintenance of the sprawling complex, its elaborate gardens and hidden chambers, but also the continuous acquisition of new specimens, the management of existing residents, and the specialized education of those destined for the king's most intimate and perverse rituals. Their organizational charts were as complex as any modern government department, with specialized roles for preparers, attendants, disciplinarians, memory specialists whose job it was to erase former identities, compliance instructors who refined techniques of submission, and even recreational facilitators who curated the king's specific, often dark, entertainment needs. Their training was as rigorous as any soldier's, but it focused not on combat, but on psychological manipulation and control. They learned to identify vulnerabilities, exploit weaknesses, and break spirits with chilling precision. They understood that absolute power for the king meant absolute control over his human property, and they were the masters of that control. This wasn't merely intuition, it was a refined science, passed down through generations of eunuch administrators who meticulously documented human behavior, limits, and breaking points. They developed a unique understanding of human limits and breaking points, using this knowledge to refine techniques of submission that were passed down through generations of eunuch administrators, ensuring a chilling consistency in the degradation process. This intellectual expertise in human suffering allowed them to implement conditioning protocols with a detached professionalism that bordered on the grotesque. Inside the Andarun, the eunuchs created a rigid hierarchy among the inhabitants, a cruel masterpiece of divide and conquer. New arrivals occupied the lowest rung, subjected to the most intense scrutiny and harshest training. Long-term residents held meager privileges, perhaps a slightly better garment, a less arduous duty, or a moment of the king's fleeting, capricious favor that depended entirely on their absolute compliance. This system ensured that victims policed each other. Senior concubines and male companions, desperate to maintain their tiny status in this oppressive ecosystem, would eagerly report on newer arrivals who showed signs of resistance, despair, or even a fleeting memory of their past lives. Trust was a luxury no one could afford, ensuring no solidarity could form against their captors. Any flicker of hope or mutual support was ruthlessly extinguished, replaced by a pervasive atmosphere of suspicion and cutthroat competition for scraps of dignity. The architecture of the Andarun itself was a tool of control, a physical manifestation of their psychological strategies. Endless, deliberately confusing corridors, twisting and turning in ways that defied logical navigation, ensured perpetual disorientation. Hidden passages allowed eunuch guards to appear anywhere without warning, fostering a constant sense of surveillance and vulnerability. Soundproofed chambers masked the screams that no one was meant to hear, while a labyrinthine layout designed to prevent navigation made escape an impossible dream. Every room, every secluded garden courtyard was connected to listening posts where eunuchs, with their acute senses, honed by years of observation, monitored conversations for signs of rebellion or escape planning. The girls and boys lived in a maze designed to make surveillance constant and freedom a distant, impossible dream, transforming their lavish surroundings into a suffocating prison. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Many eunuchs having themselves suffered unimaginable violations, the terror of castration, the psychological trauma of being stripped of their former selves, the deliberate erasure of their identities, often became the most effective and ruthless agents of the king's depravity. Their own brokenness was weaponized, turned into an instrument of terror against those they now managed. They understood intimately the pain of their charges, the fear of powerlessness, the agonizing process of psychological dismantling. Often their cruelty was born from a desire to reclaim a semblance of power over others, even if it meant perpetuating the very cycle of abuse that had consumed their own lives. They were both victims and perpetrators, trapped in a system that rewarded their darkest impulses, compelling them to inflict upon others the same dehumanization they had endured, thereby ensuring their own precarious survival and position within the palace's brutal hierarchy. Their intimate knowledge of suffering made them uniquely adept at orchestrating the rituals that followed, moving beyond mere management to become the architects of the king's most profound and intimate degradations. Within the innermost sanctum of the Anderun, far from the eyes of even the most trusted courtiers, the King of Kings presided over private rituals that transcended mere sexual indulgence. These were elaborate ceremonies of power, designed not just for pleasure, but for the systematic degradation and dehumanization of his chosen subjects. Here, the line between sacred devotion and profane perversion dissolved completely, as every act served to reinforce the king's status as a living god. The very air in these hidden chambers, thick with rare incense and unspoken terror, bent to his will, a palpable oppressive force meticulously crafted to dismantle the spirit and confirm his unchallenged dominion. The selection process for these intimate rituals was an exquisite form of psychological torture. Each evening, the king would review his collection, often a silent parade of men, women, and boys, standing in perfect lines, heads bowed. This agonizing daily pageant, choreographed by the chief eunuchs, presented specimens in a state of curated vulnerability, often clad in translucent silks that hinted at their forms while emphasizing their powerlessness. The king, moving with a predator's deliberate pace, his shadow falling across their trembling forms, would survey his silent inventory with a sharp, assessing gaze, lingering on each face, each limb. He would walk among them, his gaze a silent judgment, finally pointing to his choice for the night. The dread, the anticipation, the silent plea of those not chosen, and the terror of those who were. This was the opening act of his nightly theater. The rituals themselves were carefully choreographed by the eunuch managers, often drawing upon twisted interpretations of ancient Persian religious practices. What began as purification rites were perverted into ceremonies of submission. The eunuchs, masters of both Persian spiritual traditions and the breaking points of the human spirit, distorted sacred acts of cleansing and anointing into elaborate preambles to defilement. The chosen individual would be ritually bathed, anointed with exotic oils, and dressed in garments designed to emphasize their vulnerability. This bathing was a ceremonial stripping away, a symbolic erasure of their former identity and humanity. Every movement, every gesture, was prescribed and meticulously drilled, forcing compliance and erasing any semblance of personal will, reducing them to living dolls on the king's stage. Accounts gleaned from fragmentary foreign diplomatic reports and later Roman historians hint at sacred performances where individuals were compelled to mimic animals or participate in elaborate tableaux vivants that culminated in acts of extreme sexual and physical violation. These weren't spontaneous acts of impulse, but carefully managed spectacles. Some reports whispered of victims compelled to mimic the mating calls and desperate movements of wild animals, driven by the king's laughter until their humanity was utterly stripped away. Others detailed tableaux vivants, where subjects were positioned for hours in static poses of extreme veneration or suffering, their bodies becoming living props in the king's dark fantasies. The goal was not merely gratification, but the complete, irreversible obliteration of the individual's spirit, turning them into compliant objects whose only purpose was to reflect the king's absolute power. One particularly disturbing aspect was the educational program for new arrivals. Specially selected eunuchs, often themselves veterans of these rituals, would train the chosen ones in anticipating the king's most obscure desires. This wasn't about etiquette. It was about breaking down their minds, systematically erasing their boundaries and conditioning them to accept their new reality as normal, even desirable. This curriculum of psychological torture, meticulously designed by eunuch compliance instructors intimately familiar with human breaking points, involved a systematic dismantling of identity itself. Days were spent in relentless drills, where victims were forbidden from speaking their former names, their past lives systematically erased through enforced silence and repetition. Psychological reconditioning so thorough that victims would forget their own names and beg for the privilege of serving their captors, their spirits utterly rewired to embrace servitude. The king's chambers contained specialized apparatus, described vaguely in some texts as instruments of pleasure and persuasion. These weren't crude torture devices in the traditional sense, but sophisticated implements designed to inflict prolonged, exquisite agony while maintaining consciousness, ensuring the victim remained fully aware of their degradation. These exquisite mechanisms, often wrought from polished metals and rare woods, were engineered for the meticulous infliction of prolonged, exquisite agony, carefully calibrated to maintain the victim's consciousness at its most acute level. The goal was absolute awareness of their escalating degradation, maximizing mental torment alongside the physical. The silence in these chambers was often broken only by muffled screams, which were considered music by the king's closest attendants, a macabre symphony of broken wills affirming his divine authority. The psychological damage was compounded by the king's occasional benevolence. A victim who endured their ordeal with sufficient compliance might be rewarded with a trinket, a slightly better meal, or a temporary reprieve from further torment. These were not genuine rewards, but meticulously calculated tools of control, shards of false hope, offered just enough to sustain the illusion of possible escape from suffering. This perverse system fostered a twisted, desperate competition among the human property, each striving for the king's capricious favor, hoping for a moment of reduced pain or a scrap of fleeting privilege. The king had turned basic human needs into weapons of psychological manipulation, ensuring that his subjects became invested in the very system that enslaved and brutalized them, their minds rewired to seek validation and survival within the confines of their own degradation. In a realm where the king's word was divine law, the horrors within the Anderun remained a meticulously guarded secret, protected by a vast network of fear, coercion, and systematic elimination. Those who became inconvenient, who resisted too strenuously, or who simply knew too much, vanished without a trace, their existence erased as completely as footprints in the desert sand. The king's absolute power demanded not just compliance in life, but complete non-existence in death, a final act of erasure that extended even to memory. This meticulous veil of secrecy was an intrinsic part of the terror itself. It wasn't enough for individuals to simply disappear. Their removal had to be so absolute, so devoid of evidence, that it fostered a pervasive paranoia among those remaining within the palace walls. The absence of a person became a more potent weapon than their presence, a chilling void that served as a constant, unspoken warning. Rumors, carefully cultivated by the eunuchs, would circulate about the terrible fate of the vanished, but always without verifiable details, thus amplifying the dread and ensuring that no one could ever pinpoint the precise nature of the disappearance. The disposal system was as efficient as every other aspect of this nightmare. Women who became pregnant, boys who outlived their usefulness, or anyone who showed signs of disease or excessive psychological damage simply disappeared from the records. No questions were asked, no inquiries tolerated. Their removal was handled by dedicated eunuch teams who operated with absolute discretion and chilling effectiveness. The preferred methods were often swift and silent, ensuring no screams reached beyond the Anderun's thick walls. These teams meticulously managed not just the physical removal, but also the bureaucratic erasure. Names scrubbed from ledgers, personal effects destroyed, and any mention of their existence expunged from all official communications. It was a formal process of unbeing, reducing a living, breathing person to a non-entity, a ghost in the collective memory. For those deemed unfit or undesirable, the transition from human property to non-person was swift and irreversible. Eunuchs maintained detailed inventories, not just of arrivals, but also of defections, transfers, or conclusions of service, all euphemisms for systematic extermination. A slight cough, a persistent tremor, a look of despair that hinted at an unbroken spirit. Any of these could trigger the final decree. The executioners themselves were often former victims, conditioned over years to perform these grim duties with emotionless efficiency, knowing that their own lives depended on their unwavering compliance. Their intimate knowledge of the Anderun's labyrinthine passages allowed for discreet transport of bodies through hidden tunnels and concealed exits, often leading to unceremonious burials far out in the desert, or worse, disposal into the depths of the palace's own forgotten wells. The fate of those who attempted escape was a terrifying lesson to others. Recaptured individuals faced punishments designed to maximize psychological and physical torment, often becoming public spectacles of suffering within the Anderun itself, before their eventual silent elimination. These demonstrations served to reinforce the message that the walls of the golden cage were impenetrable, both physically and psychologically. The lessons were orchestrated with chilling theatricality. A recaptured individual might be left in a prominent courtyard, visibly broken and suffering for days, their agony a silent sermon for all to witness. Their pleas, their desperate cries, were allowed to echo through the inner chambers, a macabre soundtrack to the everyday lives of the remaining subjects, until finally, they too vanished into the silent sand. The eunuchs played a critical role in enforcing this silence. They were the ultimate gatekeepers, controlling all information in and out of the Anderun. Letters from families were intercepted and destroyed. Any whisper of dissent or discontent was reported immediately, and the source swiftly dealt with. They understood that their own survival depended on maintaining the king's secrets, and they were masters of information control, creating psychological prisons that were often more effective than physical barriers. These men, castrated and brutalized themselves, were transformed into the king's most effective instruments of terror. Their vigilance was absolute. Their loyalty, born of desperation and the promise of power, unyielding. A misplaced glance, a subtle shift in tone, an unbidden tear. Any deviation from the prescribed mask of submission was noted, recorded, and often led to fatal consequences. They curated the reality within the Anderun, ensuring that only the king's narrative prevailed. Foreign ambassadors and visitors, accustomed to the brutal politics of their own lands, occasionally glimpsed the darker side of the Persian court. Reports from Greek historians and later Roman accounts often contained veiled references to unnatural practices within the palace, to children selected for the king's pleasure, and to the unusual silence that often surrounded the king's most private chambers. However, direct accusations were rare, for to challenge the King of Kings on such matters was to invite swift and catastrophic retaliation against one's own nation. These diplomatic whispers were carefully phrased, coded observations recorded in personal journals or encrypted dispatches, never in official documents. They spoke of the opulence that masked a palpable dread, of the exquisite perfumes that couldn't quite conceal the stench of fear, of the radiant smile of the king that could turn to stone in an instant. Many of these diplomats and merchants, seeking to curry favor or simply to survive, became unwitting accomplices in the cover-up. They would accept opulent gifts, participate in grand ceremonies, and then return to their homelands, carefully omitting any uncomfortable truths from their official reports. The conspiracy of silence extended far beyond Persia's borders, maintained through mutual political blackmail and shared guilt. Their silence was bought with gold, prestige, and the implicit threat of imperial wrath. They returned home, their hands metaphorically stained by their complicity, carrying back tales of Persian grandeur while deliberately editing out the silent screams that echoed from behind gilded walls. This international complicity ensured that the king's dark rituals remained safely shrouded, a horrifying ghost story relegated to the footnotes of history, too unspeakable for public record. Even the king's inner circle, his most trusted advisors and generals, understood the unwritten rules. They might discuss strategy, logistics, and foreign policy, but never the nightly rituals within the Anderun. To acknowledge it was to risk becoming part of its grim machinery. This created a profound psychological dissonance. Powerful men who commanded armies and empires would avert their gaze from the horrors unfolding just footsteps from their own quarters, normalizing the unthinkable through collective denial. Their silence was a fragile pact, a collective delusion that allowed them to retain their sanity, their positions, and their lives, even as the monstrous truth gnawed at the edges of their consciousness. This pervasive denial, this deliberate blindness to the moral abyss at the heart of their power, was perhaps the ultimate victory of the king's dark system. The horrific bedroom rituals of the Persian kings were not isolated aberrations. They were deeply embedded in the very fabric of the Achaemenid Empire, shaping its internal dynamics, its external relations, and its eventual downfall. This pervasive depravity became a festering wound at the heart of the realm, a cancer that slowly consumed the very soul of the empire from within. The systematic dehumanization within the Anderun, where human beings were reduced to disposable commodities, became a microcosm of imperial control, demonstrating with chilling clarity how absolute power, unchecked by moral constraints, poisons everything it touches. The psychological impact on the royal court was profound, creating a quagmire of fear and calculated opportunism. Loyalty was measured not by competence or integrity, which were seen as dangerous liabilities, but by absolute submission and active complicity in the king's darkest desires. Courtiers vied for favor by offering gifts to the Anderun, often beautiful concubines, exotic boys, or the children of rivals, eagerly participating in the procurement system. They understood that their own advancement, their very survival, depended on their willingness to facilitate the king's perversions and avert their gaze from the atrocities that sustained their positions. This created a culture of sycophancy and profound moral decay, where the pursuit of power justified any act, no matter how heinous. The king's image, outwardly divine and unchallengeable, was internally sustained by a perverse cult of personality. His bedroom rituals were, in a twisted sense, extensions of his divine prerogative, sacred acts that reaffirmed his status not merely as a ruler, but as a living God whose desires were beyond human judgment or earthly law. This theological justification, meticulously crafted by court priests who themselves became deeply compromised, allowed for the most extreme acts of cruelty and sexual violence to be reframed as sacred duties. It fundamentally corrupted the spiritual foundations of the empire, replacing genuine piety with a cynical manipulation of faith that sanctified depravity. The economic consequences, though often concealed by the empire's vast wealth, were substantial and insidious. Vast resources were diverted from crucial infrastructure projects, military expenditures, or public welfare to maintain the elaborate and ever-expanding machinery of the Anderun. This included not only the cost of housing and feeding hundreds of captives, but also the acquisition of specialized craftsmen for torture devices, exotic goods for perverse banquets, and a large retinue of eunuchs, guards, and attendants. This immense hidden expenditure subtly but consistently drained the empire's wealth for the gratification of one man's increasingly depraved appetites, slowly undermining its long-term stability. The empire's wealth was indeed built on its people, but also, quite literally, consumed them. The empire's diplomatic standing was also subtly undermined, eroding trust and fostering suspicion among foreign powers. While no foreign nation dared to openly condemn the formidable Persian king, the whispered rumors carried by returning envoys, coupled with their own uncomfortable experiences and glimpses behind the gilded facade, created a lingering and profound distrust. Alliances, once solid, became fragile, built solely on fear rather than genuine respect or shared values. Other nations began to view the great king not just as a formidable and unyielding power, but as a morally corrupt and decadent force, contributing to a narrative of weakness and internal decay that would eventually be skillfully exploited by ambitious invaders like Alexander the Great. The long-term psychological effects on the royal family and subsequent generations are chilling to contemplate, forming a lineage plagued by paranoia, incest, and inherited cruelty. Children raised within this environment, even those destined for the throne, would have witnessed or been acutely aware of the horrors unfolding around them. This constant exposure to systematic cruelty, the pervasive presence of dehumanization, and the normalization of extreme power could only breed further dysfunction and depravity, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where each successive ruler sought new depths of perversion to assert their absolute authority. Empathy became a weakness, ruthlessness, a virtue. Ultimately, the very systems designed to consolidate power through terror contributed directly to the empire's internal rot and inevitable decline. A ruling class focused primarily on personal gratification, internecine court intrigue, and complicity in atrocities, rather than effective governance, military defense, and the welfare of its subjects, inevitably weakens from within. The organs of state became atrophied, dedicated to maintaining a terrifying facade rather than ensuring effective administration. The grand facade of Persepolis, gleaming under the desert sun, hid not just treasures of untold wealth and cultural brilliance, but also the unspeakable suffering of countless individuals, a silent testament to the ultimate price of unchecked, absolute power. The whispers of the Anderun may have been meticulously silenced by history, but their chilling legacy remains, a stark reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often found not in myth, but in the corrupted heart of human authority. If this journey through ancient Persia's hidden horrors left you questioning everything you thought you knew, hit that like button, subscribe for more suppressed histories, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the darkest corners of human power. And tell me in the comments below, what aspect of the King of Kings' hidden rituals disturbed you the most? Your engagement helps us keep these forgotten stories alive. We started with the image of a glorious empire, but what we've uncovered reveals a truth far more disturbing. The opulent palaces and vast wealth of ancient Persia harbored a system of systematic degradation, where human beings were reduced to commodities, their lives and dignity sacrificed to the depraved appetites of the King of Kings. This isn't just ancient history. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when absolute power meets absolute impunity, where morality is twisted into justification for unspeakable acts, and where human suffering is bureaucratized into a science of control. The comfort of sanitized history often hides oceans of blood and countless untold stories. Stay curious, stay critical, and never stop questioning the narratives presented by those in power. Because the most dangerous truths are often the ones they tried hardest to bury.